Right now we're going to hear from our industry keynote, Mr. Eric Ebeling. Eric is from American Roll-On Roll-Off Carrier Group. It's the largest U.S. flag roll-on roll-off carrier and the third largest U.S. flag carrier operating in international trade. Eric Ebeling has been president and CEO of ARC since October of 2015, but he previously served as the president and chief operating officer from June of 2012. He holds a doctoral degree in law from American University, Washington School of Law, and is a licensed attorney. Being a recent 1998 graduate of Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, he's still in his 40s. Earns him the distinction of being one of the youngest C-suite professionals I know. Eric and I have worked together since my time at TRANSCOM. He and the ARC team move a lot of important things for the military, and I can personally attest to Eric's love of our country and his commitment to give back. Please, a warm welcome for Eric Ebeling.
All right. A little Metallica to wake everybody up there. Okay. Good morning and welcome to the NDTA-USTRANSCOM fall meeting for 2019. It's appropriate to state outright the full title of this meeting, just to emphasize the fact that this is a joint industry and DoD meeting. So thank you to the NDTA leadership and staff and to General Lyons and the entire TRANSCOM team for ensuring that we have this incredible interface again this year. It shouldn't be taken for granted. This year marks the 75th anniversary of NDTA, as we've heard all week, whose educational mission really forms the connective tissue between and amongst DoD and other government stakeholders, and the private sector consisting of asset-owning industrial base partners, labor, and other transportation and logistics interests. I've been an NDTA member since joining the U.S. flag maritime industry back in 2003, and I've seen the great successes that this partnership has accomplished in the interim. Unfortunately, the lessons learned of going to war together and the value of that public-private partnership are periodically forgotten or overlooked. So it's really incumbent on all of us in this room to continue the dialogue, build trust, and to ensure the assets and networks that support TRANSCOM, the TRANSCOM mission, are not just available, but also well-supported and truly understood. As we contemplate NDTA's 75th anniversary, it's relevant to take a pause and reflect on the exceptional leaders at NDTA. With current and recent chairmen John Dietrich, Bill Flynn, and Ray Ebeling, and current and recent past presidents Andy Brown, Buzz Busby, and Ken Weichel. There's really no guarantee or entitlement for NDTA to have enjoyed such outstanding leadership, and the same or similar can be said for General Lyons and the outstanding DoD and other government leaders with us today as well. And it's really only through volunteerism at NDTA that NDTA will be able to support the deployment, distribution, sustainment, and readiness of this great nation for another 75 years. The theme of this year's fall meeting is fostering partnerships to preserve peace and prevail in conflict, then, now, and tomorrow. I must say that most conference themes are pretty instantly forgettable, but I'd implore the audience to take a moment and really think about this one, because I think it's timely and prescient to most of us in this room and why we're all here today. So I'll use the then, now, and tomorrow framework in my remarks this morning. Looking back at the beginning of then, 75 years ago, we find a seminal moment in U.S. defense and world history, the Allied landings on D-Day in Normandy on June 6, 1944. I was privileged to have the opportunity to visit Normandy earlier this year with my wife and two daughters. If you're in the field of transportation and logistics, and you walk Omaha and Utah beaches, the airborne sector, and perhaps most especially the American Military Cemetery, as we did, you realize the incredible feats of human bravery and military logistics planning required that we had to accomplish then. To the extent your faith in this enterprise ever wavers, I'd encourage a terrain walk in Normandy, and it will be instantly restored. In the years since World War II, our logistics forefathers put together some truly remarkable defense readiness programs and institutions, including but not limited to CRAF in 1952, Cargo Preference Act of 1954, DLA in 1961, TRANSCOM in 1987, NSD 28 in 1989, MSP and Visa in the 1990s, and the DDoCs in the early 2000s, just to name a few, and many others along the way. Many of these enterprises and platforms have been strengthened and renewed in the years since, thanks in no small part to those in this room. So where are we today and what's next? And perhaps more to the point, what will be the legacy of those of us in this room? Since Sealift and affiliated logistics support is my foremost area of expertise and experience, I'll focus most of my comments there. Today, the U.S. flag fleet is number 22 in the world internationally. Numbers 1 through 3 are, in order, Panama, the Marshall Islands, and Liberia, comprising 40% between them. 90% of the world's ships are built in 3 countries, primarily China, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. China alone builds 1/3 of the world's ships. Of the top 20 container ports in the world, only one is in the U.S., LA Long Beach, in the high teens. Should we be satisfied with this state of affairs? Does it matter? How did we get there? As Clint Eastwood might say, let's take a step back and look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. As a starting point, it's important to note that the private sector, no matter what industry, is driven by a bottom-line motivation, also known as profit motive. In other words, you have to make money to stay in business. Without profit motive, none of Transcom's commercial partners will survive, let alone thrive. Next, turning to the state of the fleet. Over the decades, we've experienced bad or non-existent government policy for large periods of time, ineffective support programs and occasionally ineffective operators, counterproductive labor negotiations by both sides, predatory and often state-backed foreign competitors, and other challenges. If you're looking for a more detailed treatise, I'd recommend The Abandoned Ocean, a book by Andrew Gibson and Arthur Donovan. But it's certainly not all bad. Ship count by itself is a crude metric and sometimes misleading, but does provide some insight. The number of U.S. flagged ships engaged in in foreign commerce in 1993 was 116 ships. By 1997, we were down to 76, but by 2002, we were back up to 85. By 2012, we were closer to 120, and we're now back in the 83 to 85 range. But what happened during that time frame? Primarily, the Maritime Security Program in 1996 and the Voluntary Intermodal Sealift Agreement shortly thereafter on the policy side, and, of course, Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom on the cargo side. Digging a bit deeper into those figures, there's been an ongoing shift from primarily a container fleet to a more balanced fleet, including more ro-ros and heavy lift multi-purpose ships. These shifts were directly in response to the demand signal from DoD and other segments of government preference cargoes. In 2005, there was only 1.2 million square feet of ro-ro capacity, but by 2019, there was 3.1 million square feet. And if one includes the heavy lift segment, we're up to 3.4 million square feet, almost triple. So as not to leave the container fleet out, those ships are also bigger and more flexible than they were. And the same is largely true on the airlift side of the equation, by the way. This clearly shows that if the cargo and the right incentives are there, industry will invest and make the requisite commitments. In other words, the assets and networks will be there. Assets and networks go directly to Transcom's #1 priority, warfighting readiness. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Sustainment Bob McMahon, who was with us yesterday, stated earlier this year that, quote, clearly DoD cannot accomplish its mission without partnership with commercial partners in the world of logistics and sustainment. Our success is reliant on that partnership. Inspiring and true words by Mr. McMahon. Why do we have such mobility programs? Specifically, why does DoD need sealift policy and programs? It's because of how we choose to fight, and I'll emphasize choose. The major strategic advantage, as General Lyons touched on earlier, is for the U.S. military is its ability to project and sustain forces anywhere and anytime. As then Lieutenant General Lyons wrote in a 2016 article in Army Sustainment magazine, most professional Army logisticians are familiar with the detailed planning of TIPFID and getting unit equipment and personnel from port to port of embarkation, as well as the reception, staging, and onward movement and integration from port of debarkation to foxhole and fight. But how does it get from POE to POD, and often how does it get from door to door? 90 to 95% of that cargo moves via strategic sealift, due primarily to size, scale, and mass, whether via the organic gray hull fleet or the U.S. flag commercial fleet. A single ship can carry the equivalent of 300 C-17 Globemasters. Today, the concepts of contested environment, distributed maritime operations, and other related strategic imperatives are changing the geographic and temporal coverage of logistics. Vessels may need to operate more independently, perhaps at risk in a contested environment or physical or cyber environment. This may actually make the commercial fleet even more relatively valuable in some respects, as the distinction between these two fleets, organic and commercial, can be boiled down to the fact that the former has to be activated, often at great cost, while the commercial fleet is always active. The latter is a fleet in being, hiding in plain sight, deployed around the world, and available to call ports and provide intermodal services where DoD either doesn't want to have a footprint or may not be able to otherwise access. In addition, it's the loyal, well-trained American citizen merchant mariners that serve in the commercial fleet that must be called upon to crew the government-owned reserve fleet. To that end, I offer a brief comment in support of military-to-mariner programs to help DoD service members transition to merchant mariner status, but must point out that without a commensurate increase in cargo, and therefore the size of the commercial fleet, there will not be many employment opportunities for new mariners. Most DoD mobility and capability requirement studies over the past decades have shown an enduring need for 19 to 20 million square feet of capacity. The MSP Visa-allied commercial fleets provide about 4 million square feet of that, mostly through the MSP fleet. A lot of great work's been done by Transcom's JD PAC, OSD CAPE, as well as by the recent Defense Science Board study on survivable logistics, the latter of which I was honored to participate on. But what is still not all that well understood is the extent and value of the networks those MSP and Visa carriers provide. There's an older NDTA study that cited a $65 billion value for the ships and networks of MSP, and a more recent study that suggested it was now $71 billion. We quibble sometimes over the provenance of the numbers and analysis, but let's perhaps just put aside what the precise number may be and simply agree that the cost to the government to acquire, operate, maintain, and recapitalize those assets from time to time and the networks would be somewhere in the tens of billions of dollars. So money well spent, because without MSP, there would be no U.S. flag international carriers. Without the Jones Act, there would be no U.S. flag domestic carriers. And without cargo preference, there would be no U.S. flag carriers at all. And without the carriers, the quality, capacity, and capability that DoD relies on wouldn't be there either. Your very best industry partners, whether sealift, airlift, or other modes, are connected to the versatile global supply chain offering far more than just ships or planes. Because while those assets are the ticket to admission for the respective industrial base programs, it's about far more than just the steel. Look no further than the fact that about 90% of the cargo moved on commercial ships and networks for the sustainment phases of OIF and OEF, whether PAC-GLOC, NDN, Sea Air Multimodal, or other nodes and locks. U.S. flag shipping requires for its survival that the U.S. government maintain a long-term maritime policy and committed support programs. Why? The answer lies with the realities of the global economy, where it's all about low cost, whether capital, operating, or labor. For additional context, allow me to share some of the latest trends and market intel from the international ro-ro shipping sector. Global light vehicle manufacturing, or the car market, is slowing. China actually leads that decline. U.S. auto sales peaked in 2016 at about 17.5 million units sold. We're currently down from that in the U.S., but it's still pretty solid, as higher sales of SUVs and light trucks continue to be the key drivers. Market risks in the segment include trade friction, a no-deal Brexit, high debt levels across the developed world, and geopolitical tensions. Turning to the high and heavy market segment, consisting primarily of agricultural, mining, power, and other large cargoes, year-on-year growth is down about 1%, with similar market drivers from trade friction and slowing growth globally, but also driven by recent poor planting conditions driving the ag sector. The recent 3-year growth cycle has been driven by U.S. and European residential construction and the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. The global car carrier fleet is sized to meet these market trends and currently consists of 733 vessels offering 4 million CEU, or car equivalent units, capacity as of mid-2019. Unfortunately, current commercial rates are generally not very attractive for carriers to order new vessels. The global new build order book is at near historically low levels, with only about 30 to 35 ships on order for delivery by 2022, which is less than 4% of the active fleet. The major future trends in this industry are expected to be 1, a growing but decelerating world economy. 2, most light vehicles expected to be electric within the next 10 to 15 years. 3, autonomous vehicles and flexible manufacturing growing in importance. 4, changing mobility models and expected new market entrants. And 5, a strong dollar as U.S. monetary policy tightens, trade disputes rumble on, and there is a flight to safety and quality in the markets. As a slight caveat, I'll offer a great quote attributed to Bill Gates. Quote, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Close quote. Car carriers, which today includes PCTCs, LCTCs, and pure RoRos, were historically the bridge to the Japanese economic miracle, with liner service products reaching from origin in Japan to end markets in the US and Europe, and the return voyage built into the export price to ensure capacity was available despite little return cargo. As the industries become more global and the car carriers more flexible as a result, markets are now harder to forecast and more diffuse. In 1990, just 5 countries produced 80% of the world's vehicles, led by Japan at 30%, followed by the US at 25%, and then Germany, France, and Italy. Today, China is number 1 at 30%, and it takes 12 countries worth of production to get to the level of 80% of global products. The good news for DoD is that your U.S. flag carriers are deployed in support of these more global routes and are generally more flexible as a result. In addition, the ship designs continue to evolve in terms of design, build, and configuration. As an example, ARC's ongoing fleet recapitalization included 3 RoRos reflagged to U.S. registry this year, all of which have a high door opening and main deck that may originally have been built for high and heavy mining equipment and other high and heavy commercial cargo, but is also ideally suited to the carriage of CH-47s and airlift config, V-22 Ospreys, and BCT equipment. Today's U.S. flag fleet is more capable and flexible than it was just 10 to 15 years ago, and it continues to evolve. Liner networks continue to be the backbone of the industry and provide ready-made access and capability to commercial customers and DoD in Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. But strategic unpredictability, operational unpredictability, and ever-changing demand signals are also commercial facts of life, and this makes your U.S. flag carriers more adaptable, including to such DoD notions as dynamic force employment. It's important to be cognizant of the challenges of operating in open, competitive, global markets, as U.S. flag carriers and international trade do. Look no further than the pending IMO 2020 low sulfur fuel challenge as an example of such challenges. Of course, it's impossible to predict what will happen, but based on current trends and forecasts, we conservatively estimate that the cost across the U.S. flag MSP fleet will be at least $150 million per year. That's just the increase, and it's equivalent to half the value of MSP annual funding, for which we all fight so hard for annual appropriations. There's no obvious or easy solution to this challenge, but carriers have been educating their international customers for several years now, including implementing fair and reasonable fuel adjustment factors that apportion cost and risk. And since the U.S. flag fleet would probably not exist but for to service DoD requirements, it seems reasonable to ask DoD to share in addressing the challenge to ensure the assets and networks remain competitive and available. We've covered the U.S. flag commercial fleet at some length, but what about the organic surge sealift fleet and the Ready Reserve Force? The RRF was originally established back in 1977, consisting of World War II Victory ships, with an average age then of 33 years old. Today's RRF, although recapitalized in the 1990s, now has an average age of about 44 years old. One might reasonably ask, who cares? Certainly the nation can and should have a reliable, modern surge fleet, but the RRF obviously isn't that. Some might point to the state of U.S. shipbuilding as a culprit, and while there are certainly challenges there, the relatively little known fact is that 86% of the 35 RoRos in the RRF were foreign built. At an annual cost that's 50% higher per ship than an active, fully crewed, networked MSP ship, this seems an area ripe for challenging of assumptions. So is the RRF right for today, let alone tomorrow? At a recent posture hearing, it was noted by House Armed Services Sea Power Subcommittee ranking member Rob Whitman of Virginia that, quote, "With no recapitalization in place and only the distant hope that the Navy will find this a priority, I continue to be perplexed as to how the Army and Marine Corps hope to get to the future battlefield on these aged ships, close quote. The good news is that through the efforts of Navy, TRANSCOM, MARAD, and others, 7 used foreign-built ships are now authorized to be acquired by DoD, although 5 of those have strings attached. But 26 buy-used ships are forecast to be needed. At the risk of breaking some long-held rice bowls, does the government need to be a ship owner? Why not turn to MSP and visa operators who are experienced in and understand the international markets in which they compete to acquire, charter, or lease and manage the vessels needed? We should at least consider offering a priority for the acquisition or utilization of MSP visa assets for RRF recap, as MSP ships are by definition militarily useful or could not otherwise be enrolled in the program. Such ships are also already U.S. flagged, subject to U.S. Coast Guard regulatory oversight, and manned by American merchant mariners, and so of well-known worth. Collectively, we have a unique opportunity to shape the DoD supply chain and logistics of tomorrow. How do we challenge long-held assumptions on sea lift, prepo, fixed infrastructure such as warehousing, and leverage networked logistics so that we're more diffuse and effective? Where is the innovation in logistics today, and where will it be tomorrow? A clear and obvious starting point is ensuring that we have the assets and programs already in place. For Sealift, the pending MSP long-term reauthorization will ensure we have those 30-year assets and related networks in place through 2035. So kudos to TRANSCOM and MARAD leadership, and thanks, industry and labor, and our partners in Congress for having the foresight to see that. But why not grow it? MSP costs just $5 million per ship, 50% less than the RRF ships, as noted. It has 60 always active ships. The total global logistics network provides 2,700 mariners, has 0 capital cost to the government, supports about 5,000 shoreside jobs, and helps project U.S. soft power. There's also the ongoing cargo challenge, both in terms of certain civilian agency cargo percentage reductions and in terms of overall volumes, not least the challenge of a fully functioning U.S. Export-Import Bank, which led to a decline in U.S. flag cargoes generated by Exim from over $100 million as recently as 2012 to just $2.4 million worth of cargo in 2018. Fortunately, at least on the RoRo side, defense cargoes have been on the rise these past few years from recent troughs 3 to 5 years ago. Another ongoing challenge, specifically for DoD cargo, is late allocation or booking of cargo. This should really be low-hanging fruit and an easy fix. Whether cargo is moving liner, time charter, or voyage charter, we really need to get to a place where the carrier can definitively plan for DoD cargo at least 30 days out through firm bookings. That way, there's sufficient time for true planning and network collaboration with DoD for the successful awardee, but equally important, also time for any unsuccessful offerer to obtain non-DoD commercial cargoes and stay on good terms with other customers, including, incidentally, in support of DoD personal property cargoes and other government and commercial cargoes. But to truly move the needle, we need a national sealift policy and the national willpower to meet such challenges. There's relatively recent precedent for such a quick turnaround on policy that can be found in the post-Gulf War 1990s. During the Gulf War, U.S. flagged commercial carriers carried just 21% of dry cargo, and rather incredibly, foreign flag carriers carried 23% of dry cargo, often with poor results, including non-delivery, an unknown to today's logistics planners. The lack of RoRo capability was an especially deeply felt shortcoming, and the lessons learned led to the development of the original 47-ship MSP fleet and Visa, the last round of RRF recap, and the $4.5 billion LMSR shipbuilding program, all in the 1992 to 1997 timeframe. More recently, MSP grew to a larger and more militarily useful state with a 2005 reauth, and it continues to evolve. Sealift readiness is today the #1 delineated readiness issue for TRANSCOM, and despite the fact that DoD is not just one of our biggest customers, but also occasionally our biggest competitor through the organic fleet, commercial industry is committed to helping you meet that challenge. I believe all recognize that this has to be a partnership and not a vendor-type relationship if we are to collectively be successful. Without the ability to provide soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines with the resources needed to win on the battlefield, the development of advanced tactics and technology may not have the opportunity to matter. As we examine current and emerging high-end threats to the DoD logistics enterprise, I'd encourage bringing your key commercial logistics and asset providers into classified meetings as appropriate. Your industry partners have to innovate and develop new and improved value propositions in order to survive. We can help mitigate threats to the DoD logistics enterprise by jointly developing concepts such as disaggregation, deception, hardening, resilience, and others. The importance of both airlift and sealift is clearly not properly wargamed, and as industry continues to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in assets and networks to support DoD, it seems right and proper to discuss the risks of attrition, cyber, A2AD, risks to commercial, civilian airmen and mariners, and the like. There's an old saying that nothing happens until something moves, which I believe was originally first enunciated by Albert Einstein, but was also a past fall meeting theme. The corollary for our purposes today is that things will only move at the speed of trust, and so we must ensure that trust is constantly renewed and strengthened. The best of commercial industry is vibrant. We can handle today's workload, and we've proven ourselves ready, willing, and able to size ourselves to DoD workload throughout history. Carriers can and do compete like hell in the commercial and government market spaces, but there is an awesome, in the truest sense of the word, willingness to put aside differences and work collaboratively with our DoD partners when the nation needs it. As we look to preserve peace and prevailing conflict in the world of tomorrow, I see that remaining a constant. While NDTA has been around for just 75 years, and the warfighting framework of today and tomorrow is ever shifting, there is a proven, long-term, and mutually beneficial history of collaboration between industry and government dating back even further. Let's make sure we keep it that way for future generations of Americans. Thank you. I look forward to your questions. Okay. All right. Questions? If there are no questions, I do have a short video that I can show. Oh, all right.
Operating in a contested environment to include the cyber domain?
So that's a great question. I would say that our role is to work collaboratively with our DoD partners, particularly TRANSCOM, to develop concepts of ways of working, but also concepts of resilience to ensure that our assets are survivable and they're always going to be there to service the requirements. It is hard to see out there. Any other questions?
We do have one more question from the app.
Yes.
What do you think Sealift will look like in the future, let's say 10 years from now, and what does DoD need to do to integrate with that shipping of the future?
Sure. So there are a number of new concepts out there that are pretty forward-looking, including even unmanned ships. I don't necessarily see that happening within the next 10 years. And in particular, for our purposes, I think you're always going to want to have redundancies and have those U.S. citizen merchant mariners on the ships so that we can ensure we're getting to the fight. But, you know, it's a little bit difficult to tell because with only 30 to 35 ships in the new order book over the next 5 years or so, there's really just not a lot of tonnage in the pipeline. So I think ship designs are probably going to continue to evolve, likely continuing the trend of getting bigger and providing more capacity. But there's probably also going to be some trends that are a little bit more environmentally friendly in terms of fuel, which we actually see in some of the Jones Act ships that are being built these days. And that'll probably start to trickle into the international markets a little bit more as well. Okay. Thank you.